Okay, so you should have a piece of watercolor paper on your board. The size of mine is roughly A4. You don't need a great big piece. This is really just for the purposes of doing some experiments based on the painting. Okay. Yeah. And I'm going to use the book rather than the printout because I think it's much nicer. Oh. Right. Organise myself. Okay, so I'm using my book here. I've divided it up with masking tape so that I've got 6 squares or 6 rectangles, depending on whatever your size of your paper is. And the next thing I would suggest you do is to put my colours over the board so you can see. So I've got, as usual, the normal colours in my palette. I've got the aureolin yellow. I put some water on it. I've got the Prussian blue, the gamboge. So I've got the 2 yellows, gamboge and aureolin. The 2 blues, Prussian blue, and up here, ultramarine blue. I'm sorry, they're not next to each other. 2 reds, the vermilion and the alizarin. And then I've got the raw sienna in there. And I put some water on all of them so that they are damp and in a state where I can brush some of the pigment off and make up some washes, which I've done here. Okay, now it doesn't really matter what colors you use, but I think if you try and mix something that is like the blue in his picture, which is I think made with Prussian blue, and it's quite pale. Maybe do some blue first of all, a nice lot of blue made with Prussian blue. So let's all start with that. So just wet your Prussian blue and put some into one of the wells. It doesn't need to be a strong mix. So, 2 or 1 brush load is probably going to be enough. And then add some water to it. If you want to try out the colour and see what it's like, then by all means do. I suppose it would be helpful to just, the thing is, I can't be too dogmatic about these colours, because looking at them, he looks like he's used all the colours that I'm suggesting. There's not much evidence in this painting of vermilion. There's no evidence at all probably of vermilion, although to achieve the sort of browny colours here, I'd suggest he's probably used raw sienna and blue, not vermilion. He may have used a little bit of alizarin in with the blue to make it a slightly redder blue for the mountains. I don't know. So the first blue I've mixed up is this one, which, as I said, is really just Prussian blue. And I'm just going to see what it looks like. Obviously wet, remember, it's going to be stronger than when it's dry. So it's advisable to have your hair dry by so you can dry things off. And I'm not drying it completely, but the wet side, you can see there, is way darker than the side that's dry. So that's what happens. Please note what happens with watercolor. It dries so much lighter than you think. And I think the light version will probably be fine to start off with for the sky.
What are we doing? Are we painting it into the...
No, I think what we should do first of all is just to mix up a range of colours in your palette. So you've got some washes mixed up available to use. So that's the blue. I think then I'd mix up something that's like this pale sienna-y type yellow. So you can use the raw sienna or yellow ochre and a little bit of gamboge or aureolin. And again, I'd make it reasonably pale, so relatively more water to colour. And then again, try it out and see what you've got. Yeah, now that looks just about, that's very wet at the moment, so by the time it dries, it's going to dry paler. Okay.
Just the aureole on its own?
No, Chris, I did say a bit of yellow ochre or raw sienna, whichever you wish. So there's my first two colours. Those of you that want to move a bit more quickly and identify other colours, just go ahead and mix them up, okay? Right, I'm going to move on to colour number 3. I'm going to do this sort of colour here that is used for the mountains. I mean, I think he's used more than one, and he's also layered them, but I'm just going to start off with a colour. Again, I think I'll use Prussian blue. But this time I'm going to, like I said to you before, I'm going to take a tiny touch of the alizarin and mix it with it. And immediately it goes into a bluey grey. Now that's gone too far, so I'm going to add some more blue to it. Oh, that's not too much.
Sorry, could you say again what you are mixing with the blue?
I put a tiny bit of alizarin with it so that it warms it up a bit.
Right.
And this is the colour I've got. I think that's a bit clean looking myself. It needs to have some raw sienna in it because this is a sort of like a grey-green colour, isn't it? So to that blue that I've just asked you to make, add a little bit of raw sienna and see what happens. It should green it up a wee bit, but be careful how much you put in. Yeah, it's worked, mine. Yeah, look. Oh, that's a nice colour. So this one here is Prussian blue, a little bit of alizarin crimson, that's the pinky red, and then also raw sienna. When the raw sienna, because it's yellowy, makes it go slightly greeny.
And if you haven't got raw sienna?
Yellow ochre.
Okay. Yellow ochre with.
And I think those 4 colours we've mixed up will be enough to start off with. Okay, you may need to adjust them. You may need to make them a little bit stronger or paler, whichever. I don't know. Again, use your painting as your guide for the sort of initial colours that he probably would have used.
Can you just say the the four colours that you put together, the last ones.
This is three colours. It's Prussian blue,
Yeah.
a little bit of alizarin, and some yellow ochre in your case. Yes. Now, for the sake of Carol and Shelley, and maybe all of you, I don't know. If you just put your brushes down, you can carry on mixing in a minute. I'm just going to move my palette out of the way. Okay. I mean, this is very basic stuff here, so forgive me, but it's still worth looking at. When I was running the classes at the Watermans, one of the sessions before we embarked on landscape work was finding out what you can do with watercolors, you know, the range of techniques. Now, you recently have been practicing wet into wet, and that's obviously one technique. This one here, the first one here, is just laying a solid color. I'm not going to go into how it's done at this moment, but that's where you actually you keep the same color and use it to create a square of one particular wash. This one, you do a stroke of your color and then gradually you add water to your mixture until at the bottom it becomes paler. Can you see that? Now, you know about this, all of you, because when you want to make a color paler, you just add water to it. You don't add white because that's not the watercolor technique. This one here is a good example of overlaying colors, because by overlaying any color, whatever it is, you automatically you get a third color appearing. And this technique is called glazing, okay, where you put one color over the other, and you probably not even aware of doing it when you're painting, but it does happen, and you can exploit it, obviously, which is why I'm talking about it. This is wet into wet, where two puddles of wet color are dropped next to each other and allowed to fuse. And we've spent a fair bit of time 2 weeks ago trying to win that copy of Leslie Worth's Working on the Sky, which I went back to with Shelley, and we've actually done some more work and finally found out sort of how to do it. I think what I would say with watercolor is you have to watch what's happening on the paper, and you have to really watch and really observe carefully. So often, you know, if you take your attention off what you're doing, the paint will dry and then the techniques don't happen as well. This one here is where a puddle of color was painted and paper towel was used while it was still wet to lift the color out. Okay. And then this one over here is masking fluid, which is something I absolutely hate, but some artists use. And it's a rubber solution that you can paint on, and it protects the area where you paint it and keeps it white. It dries sort of like, well, it dries like a film. And then you can paint round that area where you've put the masking fluid. And then when you've finished, you can rub it off and you're left with crisp white underneath. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Yeah. Down the bottom here, these three little experiments. This one was done with painting damp colour and using a sponge to soften off the edges. And we have done a bit of that in our painting, or at least I've shown you how to do it and mentioned it, but it's worth revisiting. The next one is where two sort of washes of green were painted to suggest these trees, and then some sea salt was sprinkled onto it and it was left to dry naturally. When it's completely dry and you rub the sea salt off, you get the sort of crystal like snowflakes. Let me go in closer so you can see. Is it in focus still?
Yeah.
Yeah. So can you see the little crystal? It looks like little snowflakes.
Yeah.
And it's quite fun to do. And it's, you know, it's effective if it's used well. This is where it's called hard and soft edges. So the underneath initial wash was quite wet. And then once it's dry, and this is where you leave it to dry, then you paint over it with wet paint, but you get sort of crisp lines because what's underneath is dry. So it's hard and soft edges. And I know Prue mentioned it a lot with the clouds when we were doing the Leslie Worth painting. Okay, so those are 9 different techniques which you could experiment with on your own at some point. With any subject, it's a useful thing to do because it just refreshes the mind and, you know, good to relook at. Then last year, we did a painting of a landscape, and I'll just have to go out a bit. Again, this is using a whole range of techniques. I'm just going to mention a few of them. I use a bit of wax candle to draw the brick wall. And then I use wet into wet, and I think I even put a bit of salt on this. So it's a combination of things to get texture. You can see it very beautifully down here, the sea salt over the wet brown and the wet blue. You know, what the effect it has. The colour sort of goes away from it, you know. It's obviously good for winter scenes where you might want to get the feeling of snow or rain or something like that. I mean, this one, again, it's a lot of wet into wet with salt put over the top. So we did these 6 different little experiments last year, Carol and Shelley and Sue. And then we went, I know maybe Sue was you were with me, weren't you then? We then went on to copy another landscape using some of these techniques. Now, the reason I've raised it is because it did say in somewhere, and it's not in this particular book, but in one of the books or one of the images I found online, that Turner did use, he used body color, he obviously used wet into wet in his watercolors extensively, and he used something called scratching out. Now, scratching out is done with a knife or some sharp instrument. So I have got a knife here. If you haven't got a knife, I suggested a compass point. And if you haven't got any of those, don't worry about it. And I'll show you how to use this in a minute.